In 1964, Ford Engineering did something that would change NASCAR forever. They built an engine so dominant, so technically advanced, and so utterly devastating on the track that racing officials had no choice but to ban it before it ever turned a single competitive lap. This is the story of the Ford 427 single overhead cam, the Cammer, the engine that was too good to race. The year was 1964, and Ford had a problem. Actually, Ford had a Chrysler problem. On February 23, 1964, Richard Petty piloted his Plymouth to victory at the Daytona 500, powered by Chrysler's new 426 Hemi engine. But it wasn't just Petty's win that shocked Ford. It was the complete domination. Chrysler swept the top three positions. The hemispherical combustion chambers, the massive displacement, the raw brutality of the thing, it was winning everything. Ford's 427 FE wedge engine, despite being a solid piece of engineering, simply couldn't keep up with the breathing efficiency of Chrysler's Hemi design. Ford didn't take this lightly. Remember, this was the era when racing genuinely mattered. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was gospel. If your cars were getting embarrassed at Daytona, customers weren't walking into dealerships on Monday morning. Ford needed an answer, and they needed it immediately. So in the aftermath of that devastating loss, Ford's engineers gathered at their performance development facility with one mission: build a Hemi killer. But they were not just going to copy Chrysler's homework. Ford was going to engineer something even more advanced. Something that would make Chrysler's Elephant Hemi look primitive by comparison. They were going to build America's first production-intended single overhead cam V8. And they were going to do it in 90 days. The engineering team called it the 90-day wonder. 3 months from concept to dyno. That kind of development speed was almost unheard of, but Ford was desperate and motivated. The project started with Ford's proven 427 FE side oiler block, the same bulletproof foundation they used at Le Mans. 7.0 liters of American displacement, 680 pounds of cast iron and steel. But everything above the deck surface was completely revolutionary. While Chrysler stuck with push rods and their Hemi chamber design, Ford went full exotic, adopting European race practice. They designed a single overhead camshaft system for each cylinder bank. Overhead cams were not new. Ferrari had been using them in racing for years, and Jaguar's famous XK engine had dual overhead cams. But this was different. This was Ford taking European race technology and sizing it for America. 7 liters of displacement with overhead cams. Nobody had attempted this combination in a production engine before. The engineering was stunning. Each cylinder head featured hemispherical combustion chambers carved from cast iron, just like Chrysler's Hemi. Ford built a Hemi, their own Hemi. But here is what made it different. The overhead cam layout let Ford's engineers do something Chrysler could not. They optimized valve placement in ways a pushrod design never could. Larger valves, better positioning, less reciprocating mass fighting against itself at high revolutions per minute. The camshafts rode on 4 bearings per bank, driving shaft-mounted roller rocker arms. The entire valve train weighed significantly less than pushrods. That meant one thing: higher revs, less valve float, more power where it counted. The intake and exhaust valves were massive, optimized for maximum flow. But the valves? That is where Ford went absolutely crazy. Stainless steel stems, sodium-filled exhaust valve heads. Sodium. The stuff you find in aircraft engines, not Detroit V8s. At high temperatures, the sodium inside liquefies. It sloshes around, carrying heat away from the valve head, preventing it from burning up. This was technology borrowed from World War II fighter planes. Ford was putting aircraft engine technology into a motor you could buy at a dealership for $2,300. The timing chain on this beast measured 6 feet long. 6 feet! Think about that. A timing chain longer than most people are tall, snaking its way up to drive both overhead camshafts. Ford designed a tensioner system to prevent slack at high revolutions per minute, because without it, that chain would whip around like a rope and destroy itself. The entire setup was a masterclass in mechanical precision and a maintenance nightmare. But Ford did not care. This engine was not built for easy maintenance. It was built to destroy the Hemi. Single 4-barrel carburetor, 616 horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute. Dual 4 barrels, 657 horsepower at 7,500 revolutions per minute. Torque, 575 pound-feet. But here is the number that really mattered. Ford tested these engines past 8,000 revolutions per minute on the Dyno. 8,000. In 1964, most American V8 engines were done at 6,000 revolutions per minute. The Chrysler Hemi made peak power at 5,800 revolutions per minute and basically fell off a cliff after that. The Camry pulled cleanly past 7,500, making power up top that should not have been possible with carburetor technology, and it weighed 680 pounds, heavier than you would expect for an overhead cam engine, but bulletproof. Ford did not just dyno test it, they built prototype Galaxies, stuffed Camrys under the hood, and took them to the proving grounds. The cars were absolute rockets, massive torque combined with high revolutions per minute power capability. These were numbers that embarrassed Ferrari. That made Porsche nervous. American displacement with European sophistication. But there was a problem. NASCAR required manufacturers to homologate engines for racing, meaning they had to make them available to the public in some form. Ford had designed the Camry with this in mind. The plan was simple: build the engine, homologate it, dominate NASCAR, and sell Camrys as over-the-counter performance parts to offset development costs. Ford designated the engine as a special service option. The company prepared to install it in Galaxies, Fairlanes, even Mustangs for drag racing duty. They set up production capacity. They trained dealers. They printed service manuals. Ford was going all in. But then Chrysler caught wind of what Ford was planning, and they panicked. Chrysler knew their 426 Hemi could not compete with an overhead cam Ford engine making 657 horsepower. The Hemi was already stretched to its limit. There was no room for more development without massive investment. If Ford showed up to races in 1965 with the Camry under the hood, it was game over for Chrysler's racing program. So Chrysler did what any corporation would do when facing technological obsolescence. They called NASCAR and complained loudly. The argument Chrysler made was technically brilliant. They claimed that the Camry, with its overhead camshaft design, was not a true production engine. It was too exotic, too expensive, too complicated for regular consumers. They argued that NASCAR should be about production-based engines that regular people could actually buy and service. An overhead cam engine, Chrysler insisted, violated the spirit of stock car racing. The irony is almost painful. Chrysler's own 426 Hemi was hardly a common engine. It cost nearly $900 as an option in 1964, equivalent to about $9,000 today. Most Hemi cars never saw a racetrack or drag strip. They were barely civilized street cars with horrific fuel economy, finicky carburetors, and maintenance requirements that scared away normal buyers. But Chrysler knew how to work the politics. They threatened to pull out of NASCAR entirely if Ford was allowed to run the Camry. That would have been a disaster for NASCAR. Chrysler's factory-backed teams, their sponsorship money, their promotional support, all of it gone. NASCAR President Bill France Sr. faced an impossible choice. France had a very specific vision for stock car racing. He thought overhead cams and exotic European technology did not belong in his series. He wanted engines that looked and felt American, push rods and cast iron, not the sophisticated stuff Ferrari was running. On October 19, 1964, NASCAR issued a ruling. Both engines were banned from Grand National competition for 1965. The Ford 427 SOHC, the Chrysler 426 Hemi. NASCAR called them special racing engines. Too exotic, too advanced, no place in stock car racing. The decision was devastating, but the two companies reacted very differently. Chrysler was furious. They had just spent millions developing the Hemi. They had dominated Daytona, and now NASCAR was lumping them in with Ford's even more exotic engine. Unacceptable. Chrysler pulled out of NASCAR entirely. A complete boycott, no factory support, no sponsorship, nothing. Ford took a different approach. They would continue racing with their conventional 427 wedge engine, keep showing up, keep competing. But the Camry was going somewhere else, somewhere NASCAR could not touch it. Ford lobbied hard throughout 1965 to get the ban reversed. They argued they had followed all the rules, that they were prepared to make the engine available to customers, and that NASCAR was stifling innovation. In December 1965, NASCAR renewed the ban. The Camry was done. Dead. Or so everyone thought. April 1966. NASCAR reversed itself. The Camry was legal. Ford's engineers probably celebrated for about 30 seconds, then they read the fine print. Full-size Galaxies only. Single 4-barrel carburetor only, which limited the engine to 616 horsepower instead of 657. And here was the real killer: a 430-pound weight penalty. Let that sink in. A Camry Galaxy would have to weigh 430 pounds more than a Hemi Plymouth. That is like strapping 2 grown men to the roof and telling them to go race. Ford ran the numbers. A heavy Galaxy with less horsepower racing against lighter Plymouth and Dodge Intermediates with unrestricted Hemis. It was not permission to race, it was permission to lose. Ford told NASCAR thanks, but no thanks, and focused entirely on drag racing. Even though NASCAR banned the Camry, Ford still built them. Production numbers are murky because no official records were kept, but estimates range from 500 to 1,000 complete engines produced between 1964 and 1967. Ford sold them as over-the-counter crate engines through their dealers for $2,300. You could walk into a Ford dealership, plunk down the cash, and buy yourself one of the most advanced racing engines ever designed. The crate engine was a game changer. The drag racing community went absolutely insane for these engines. In NHRA competition, where NASCAR's politics did not matter, the Camry dominated. Absolutely dominated. Dyno Don Nicholson was running 10-second quarter miles in a Camry-powered Mercury Comet. Ohio George Montgomery was setting records. Don Prudhomme, the Snake himself, was driving a Camry dragster. With superchargers and nitromethane, drag racers were pulling over 1,500 horsepower from these engines. Some were seeing numbers closer to 2,000. The sound of a single overhead cam screaming to 9,000 RPM became iconic at drag strips across America. Horsepower defined the era. NASCAR banned it. NHRA crowned it king. The most famous Camry applications were in AFX Mustangs and Mercury Comets. Ford's factory drag racing program stuffed these engines into lightened intermediate cars and created absolute monsters. These cars were barely street legal, purpose-built drag machines that could run 10-second quarter miles on skinny bias ply tires. A handful of Shelby Cobras also got the Camry treatment. Carroll Shelby's relationship with Ford meant he had access to virtually any engine in Ford's arsenal. A few competition Cobras were fitted with Camry engines for Can-Am racing and hill climb events. The combination of a 2,000-pound car and 650 horsepower was absolutely terrifying. These cars were nearly undrivable, wheel spinning in fourth gear, requiring world-class drivers just to keep them pointed straight. But the Camry's NASCAR ban had consequences that rippled through the entire automotive industry. Ford's investment in overhead cam technology did not disappear. The engineering lessons learned on the Camry directly influenced Ford's later overhead cam engines. The single overhead cam inline-six engines that appeared in Mustangs and Falcons starting in 1967 traced their lineage back to the Camry program. Those engines were not powerful, but they proved Ford could manufacture overhead cam engines profitably. More importantly, the Camry demonstrated that American manufacturers could match or exceed European exotic engine technology. The perception that Ferrari, Jaguar, and Mercedes had a monopoly on advanced engineering was broken. An American company, using American manufacturing techniques, had built an engine that embarrassed Europe's finest. The ban also showed the ugly side of racing politics. NASCAR's decision to ban the Camry was not about safety or fairness. It was about protecting Chrysler's investment and preserving Bill France's vision of what stock car racing should be. Instead of letting engineering excellence decide races, NASCAR chose to handicap innovation. This set a precedent that continues today. Modern NASCAR uses spec engines with extremely restrictive rules specifically to prevent any manufacturer from gaining a significant advantage. Some people argue this keeps racing close and exciting. Others say it punishes innovation and turns racing into a parade of identical cars with different stickers. From a pure engineering standpoint, the 427 single overhead cam, the Camry, remains one of the most impressive engines ever designed in America. Consider what Ford accomplished. They took proven technology from European racing, scaled it to American displacement levels, engineered it for potential mass production, and created an engine that was decades ahead of its time in terms of specific output and rev capability. The Camry made 1.54 horsepower per cubic inch in race trim. In 1964, that was absolutely unheard of for a naturally aspirated American V8. It would not be until the 1990s, with modern fuel injection, computer engine management, and variable valve timing, that production engines would consistently match that specific output. Today, original Camry engines are worth a fortune. A complete, correct engine in good condition can sell for $50,000 to $100,000 or more, depending on documentation and originality. The handful of prototype Galaxies and Camry Cobras that still exist are worth millions. Several companies now manufacture reproduction Camry parts and even complete engines for vintage racing and restoration projects. The engine has a cult following among Ford enthusiasts who see it as the ultimate expression of the 1960s blue oval engineering. Engine builders regularly campaign Camrys in vintage drag racing, land speed racing, and even marine racing applications where the engine's ability to sustain high RPM makes it perfect for boat racing. The ironic postscript to this story is that NASCAR eventually allowed overhead cam engines, just not for another 50 years. The technology that Bill France called too European in 1964 is now standard across the automotive industry. Every modern performance engine uses overhead cams. The pushrod V8 engines that France wanted to protect are now the retrograde technology. If Ford had gotten that Camry homologated and racing in 1965 as planned, NASCAR history would look completely different. Ford might have dominated the late 1960s the way Chrysler actually did. Chevrolet might have been forced to develop their own overhead cam big block years earlier. The entire trajectory of American V8 development could have shifted. Instead, the Camry exists as a fascinating what-if in automotive history. It is proof that American engineers could play at the highest levels of engine design when given the resources and freedom to innovate. It's also a reminder that racing politics often matter more than engineering excellence. The 427 single overhead cam was not banned just because it was powerful. It was banned because Ford engineers built something NASCAR could not control, an engine so advanced, so well executed that letting it race would have ended competition entirely. NASCAR essentially admitted defeat before the battle even began. That is not an indictment of Ford's engineering. That is the highest possible compliment. When people ask what the greatest American racing engine ever built is, most say the Chrysler 426 Hemi, and that is a fair answer. The Hemi won races and championships. It became a legend. But the Camry never got the chance. Those people never saw the Ford 427 single overhead cam race at Daytona. They never saw it at Talladega. They never saw it dominate a NASCAR season. Because Bill France made absolutely certain that would never happen. Well, there you have it. The Ford 427 engine was so powerful, NASCAR banned it for life. The Camry stands as proof that sometimes being too good is the worst thing you can be in motorsports. Have you ever seen a Camry engine in person, or maybe you know someone with one of these legendary mills? Comment below and let's discuss. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to stay updated on our future uploads. Until then, I'll catch you on the next one.